She was not sinking. The fires were out. The crew was calm. She was moving at 25 knots. Every single signal said she would survive. And then, without warning, from deep inside her own hull, something ignited. Something that had been silently building for hours. And in that one moment, 3,000 meters below the Coral Sea, 216 men vanished. But here is what no one ever told you. It was not the enemy that took her down. Welcome to Deep Wave Discovery, where the ocean gives up its oldest secrets, one wreck at a time. Now, before we go any deeper into this story, a small request. If you are watching this right now, perhaps sitting in your favorite chair, the one you have had for 20 years, do something your grandchildren would be proud of. Find that red subscribe button and press it. Just once. That is all it takes to make sure stories like this one find their way back to you. You have remembered far harder things in your life. This one is easy. And while you are at it, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from today? Whether it is a quiet morning in Karachi, a rainy evening in London, or a late night in New York, tell us. This community stretches across every ocean, just like the stories we tell. May 8, 1942, the Coral Sea, 11:20 in the morning. 2 Japanese torpedoes struck USS Lexington on her port side. 3 bombs tore through her flight deck. Fire broke out in the crew spaces below. For any other ship, that morning would have been her last. But Lady Lex was not any other ship. Her damage control teams moved with the discipline of men who had trained for exactly this moment. They flooded the ammunition magazines before the heat could reach them. They pumped seawater against the flooding. They worked the list a dangerous 6-degree lean to one side, and they corrected it. Within 1 hour, Lexington was sailing on an even keel. Her speed, 25 knots. Her fires, contained. Her flight deck, operational. Captain Frederick Sherman stood on his bridge and assessed the situation. The conclusion was clear. Lady Lex would survive this day. He was not a reckless man. He was not an optimist without reason. Every instrument, every report, every visible indicator confirmed the same story. The ship had taken heavy blows and held. This was exactly what she had been built to do. And that is precisely where the danger began. In the world of business, military strategy, and leadership, there exists a moment more dangerous than the crisis itself. It is the moment when the numbers look better. When the bleeding appears to stop, when the team takes a breath and says, "We made it through the worst." That moment creates a very specific kind of blindness. Lexington's crew believed they had survived because they could see the evidence of survival. What they could not see, what no instrument was measuring, was what was happening in the dark spaces below. In the corridors, no one was watching. In the fuel lines that had been damaged but not fully drained. In the places where gasoline vapors were silently, invisibly gathering. Every organization has those spaces. The departments that received a memo but never truly changed. The systems that were patched but not repaired. The structural damage that was noted in a report, and then forgotten in the relief of apparent recovery. Lady Lex looked like a ship that had survived. She felt like a ship that had survived. She was moving, functioning, sailing forward. But 3,000 meters below the Coral Sea, her wreck tells a different story. Nobody was looking down. That was the problem. On the surface of USS Lexington, everything appeared to be in order. Sailors moved across the flight deck with purpose. Officers filed their damage reports. The engines hummed. The sea parted beneath her bow at 25 knots. To every eye that could see, Lady Lex was a warship in recovery. But recovery is not the same as safety. Deep inside her hull, far below the waterline, far below the reach of daylight, something was happening that no officer had ordered, and no instrument was measuring. The torpedo strikes that morning had done more than flood compartments. They had fractured fuel trunk lines, long winding pipes that carried aviation gasoline through miles of internal corridors. Standard procedure required those lines to be drained immediately after damage. Cleared, purged, they were not. And so the gasoline had nowhere to go but everywhere. It crept through cracked seams. It pooled in low corners. It turned into vapor in the warm air near electrical equipment and steam pipes. Silently, invisibly, without alarm, without warning, without a single soul aboard knowing what was accumulating in the darkness beneath their feet. At 12:47 in the afternoon, a motor generator sparked. One spark, that was all it required. The first explosion tore through the main generator room with a force that killed an entire damage control party instantly. It ruptured more fuel lines, which released more vapor, which fed the fire growing in spaces no one could reach. At 2:45, second explosion ripped through the hangar deck. Then another at 3:25. Torpedo warheads, each weighing half a ton, were being slowly cooked in the after-hangar spaces. Every man aboard understood what would happen when those warheads reached temperature. There was no stopping it now. The ship that had survived Japanese torpedoes and bombs. But organizations rarely learn. The strike that wounds you is visible, and so it receives one. Resources mobilize. Teams coordinate. Leadership steps forward. The fractured systems that were noted and set aside. The internal processes that were damaged in the chaos but never fully restored. The cultural cracks that formed under pressure and were quietly ignored in the relief of apparent survival. These do not announce themselves. They do not appear on damage reports. One small spark, one miscommunication, one ignored warning, one decision deferred for too long is all it takes. Lady Lex did not go down because Japan was stronger. She went down because her greatest threat was already inside her. Time is never neutral. It is always working, for someone or against someone. On the afternoon of May 8, 1942, time was no longer working for USS Lexington. Every minute that passed after that first internal explosion at 12:47 was a minute that cost lives, options, and ultimately the ship herself. But here is what the historical record shows with uncomfortable clarity. The decisions that could have changed the outcome were available hours earlier. The fuel trunk lines could have been drained completely after the torpedo strikes. The order existed. The procedure was documented. The men who knew how to execute it were aboard. But in the chaos of the morning battle, in the relief of apparent recovery, in the confidence of a ship still making 25 knots, that specific decision was delayed, not rejected, not forgotten entirely, simply pushed back. And delayed decisions in a damaged system do not stay delayed. They accelerate. By the time Captain Sherman realized the internal situation had moved beyond control, the chain reaction had already begun. The first explosion had triggered the second. The second had made the third inevitable. What might have required one decision at 11:30 in the morning now required the most devastating decision a commander can ever face. At 5:07 in the afternoon, he gave the order to abandon ship. 2,770 men went into the water. In remarkable discipline, in practiced order. Destroyer escorts moved in for rescue with precision that saved nearly every soul on deck. Sherman himself remained on the bridge until he was certain every living man had been accounted for. He descended to the flight deck at 5:30. And at that exact moment, the torpedo warheads detonated. The blast lifted the hangar deck. A mushroom cloud rose above the dying ship. Sherman dove into the water and was pulled aboard a destroyer. The last man off, 216 were not recovered. 35 had died in the morning air attack. 181 were killed in the internal explosions, or went down with the ship as she slipped beneath the Coral Sea at 7:56 that evening. The question that haunts this wreck is not whether the Japanese were stronger. The question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. How many of those 181 were lost not to enemy action, but to a decision that came 1 hour too late? In every organization that has ever faced a crisis, this question exists. The leaders who study history not for comfort but for instruction know that the most expensive decisions are never the ones that were made wrongly. They are the ones that were made correctly but slowly. A correct decision at the wrong time is the wrong decision. Lady Lex's damage control teams were skilled. Her captain was experienced. Her crew was disciplined. None of that was in question. What was in question was the gap between the moment the danger existed and the moment it was addressed. That gap measured in minutes aboard Lexington, measures in months inside most organizations, and the explosion always comes. She did not die quietly, and she did not die without purpose. On the evening of May 8, 1942, as USS Lexington rolled slightly to port and slipped beneath the Coral Sea, she carried with her 216 men, 7 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 3 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and 1 F-4F Wildcat fighter. She carried the weight of a morning battle that had cost everything. She carried the silence of 181 men lost not in the first strike, but in the slow hours that followed. And then she carried all of it. 3,000 meters down into absolute darkness. For 76 years, Lady Lex rested there, unknown, unconfirmed. Somewhere beneath a coral sea that covers millions of square miles and swallows secrets without effort. Survivors had recorded her last position, but coordinates on paper and a wreck at 3,000 meters depth are two very different things. That changed on March 4, 2018. Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel, equipped with autonomous underwater vehicles rated to 6,000 meters, had been systematically scanning the abyssal floor for weeks. And then the sonar painted an unmistakable image. A massive hull section, sitting upright, perfectly positioned on the seafloor at exactly 3,000 meters depth. Remotely operated vehicles descended for visual confirmation. And what they found rewrote the ending of Lady Lex's story entirely. She was not a ruin. She was a monument. Her hull number, CV-2, was visible on the wreckage. Her aircraft sat with wings still folded, as if waiting for a deck crew that would never return. The cold oxygen-poor water at that depth had preserved them with a precision that no museum could replicate. The U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command officially confirmed identification. The site was designated a war grave under the Sunken Military Craft Act. No salvage permitted. No artifacts removed. The men who went down with her remain at their posts, eternally on patrol. But here is what the wreck revealed that no damage report ever could. Lady Lex did not lose the Battle of the Coral Sea. She won it. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby, which threatened the entire Australian continent, was stopped, halted for the first time since Pearl Harbor. Japanese expansion had been turned back, and that strategic pause bought exactly the time needed for the decisive engagement at Midway 1 month later. The battle that broke Japanese naval power permanently. Lady Lex did not survive to see Midway, but Midway could not have happened without Lady Lex. Within 6 weeks of her loss, workers at the very shipyard where she had been built petitioned the Secretary of the Navy to rename an Essex-class carrier in her honor. CV-216 inherited her name, her legacy, her fighting spirit. That second Lexington served through World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and retired in 1991 as the oldest serving carrier in the United States Navy. The organization that falls with purpose. It transforms. Its lessons are embedded into the next structure built in its place. Lady Lex lit a city during a power crisis in 1929. She stopped an empire in 1942. She taught the world that defeat and legacy are never the same thing. Lady Lex is still on patrol, and she always will be.